Just run just a few quick reminders before we move on through our material. And the one thing that we talked about in particular a couple, 3 weeks ago was the matter of frequency and, let me find my marker here, the matter of frequency and it didn't work. What we call the definite article that is associated with the phrase the breaking of bread, specifically the breaking of the bread. And the difference, there is a distinction in, for example, in Acts chapter 2, with the continued in the apostles' doctrine and in the breaking of, now most of our translations don't render it such as this, but that it is indeed in the text, the breaking of the bread. Whereas in Acts 2 and verse 46, it says they continued in the eating from house to house and breaking bread, or did eat their meat. And so there's a difference in breaking bread, which simply means to eat, and the breaking of the bread, which is a specific reference to the Lord's Supper. And this is also borne out in Acts 20 and verse number 7. It says that the disciples were assembled, passive voice, were assembled or were gathered on the first day of the week to break the bread. To break the bread. And so you find, and also in that text, after Eutychus falls out of that third floor window and is raised up from the dead, it says after they had broken the bread and eaten. Note the distinction. That the Lord's Supper was observed first, and then there was a common meal which followed it. But again, the phrase, the breaking of the bread. They came together to break the bread, and after they had broken the bread and eaten. Two separate events there. And so we wanted to know just the language that distinguishes between the concept of breaking bread in just an eating sense and the breaking of the bread, which is directly connected to the observance of the Lord's Supper. We also noted with regard to frequency that there is only authorization to observe the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. And that the Lord's Supper is one of two acts of worship that are enjoined to, specifically restricted to, the first day of the week. And that is the observance of the Lord's Supper and the taking up of the collection. And so the other acts of worship that we can find, such as teaching, singing, and praying, all of these acts of worship can be engaged in at other times during the week, but only on the first day of the week can we observe the Lord's Supper, and only on the first day of the week are we authorized to take up a collection. Now, this week I want us to look at two things. Actually, there'll be kind of two or three mixed together. And if you have your list down the side, we're going to look at what I mentioned earlier on, is the idea of terminology.
Can I ask something?
Yes, sir, you may. That's why we're having class.
This
King James.
Yeah. And it don't say, it just says bread.
Bread.
It says they came to get the bread.
To break bread.
To break bread.
Yeah, and that's what a few weeks ago, whenever I wrote this, the definite article, the, is in the text. It's just not translated.
So they put it in the revised.
I don't know of any modern translation that makes the distinction. I don't know any modern translation that makes the distinction, and yet it is there. In other words, if you were to open up, if you could open up a Greek text, for example, if I was prepared, I could open up a Greek text on this computer and show it to you, and show you the word "the" is in there. All right, kind of like in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. It says, on the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store. Well, only a very few modern translations render a word that's in there, and that's the word every. 1 Corinthians 16 says, on the first day of every week. The word kata, K-A-T-A, is in the text, but it's not rendered. In other words, for some reason they didn't see fit to put the word every week, and yet it's in the text. There are a number of times in our New Testament where the definite article is not rendered, and I don't know why that. I don't know why that's the case, and so it's helpful to us. But we could, even without the definite article, we can look at the context of both of those events. For example, in Acts 20, they came together on the first day of the week.
And later on they ate the meal.
Yeah, and then later they did break bread, and then they ate. And so we can see. Now with regard to terminology, I think I may have also put in your list the idea of the forgiveness of sins. Do you have that on your list in your notebook? You should, because I know I mentioned it. And so this brief study of terminology is also going to deal with the concept of, is the forgiveness of sins received in the observance or the receiving of the elements of the Lord's Supper. Now, I found in my studies that this is almost an entirely Catholic doctrine, that the forgiveness of sins is received in the observance of the supper. But we would also, assume that in religions that are directly associated with Catholicism, that would be so. For example, all of your Orthodox churches. In other words, not only Catholic Church, but your Greek Orthodox, your Russian Orthodox. And even, I think, to some extent, there is some of that teaching, at least there was at one time, in the Lutheran Church. Of course, it being directly connected to Catholicism through the Protestant Reformation of 1517. But what I want to get to is this. Now, none of us and nobody in what we call evangelical circles refers to the Lord's Supper as Mass. Only Catholics and those that are associated with Catholicism or directly connected to Catholicism, again, the Orthodox groups, etc., use this term Mass. But, and here is, we're going to deal with this error right here as well in the use of this word. The word Mass comes from the Latin missa or messa, which means to dismiss, and I have one more, to dismiss or to send away. Now, if one held to the belief that the observance of the Lord's Supper removed sins, this makes perfect sense, doesn't it? In other words, in the observance of the Lord's Supper, there is the dismissal or the sending away of sins. And in Catholic doctrine, it would be the removal of anything that separates one from Jesus Christ. And so this is kind of the reason. And to end up where Catholicism is here, you got to make a number of drastic errors, and then pile one error on top of another error on top of another error to get to this point. In other words, there are a series of hermeneutical or interpretational blunders that get you to this point. One is that Jesus Christ is personally present in the observance of the Lord's Supper, that you're joined to Christ in the observance of the supper. And there are a number of errors that get you to this point. And so the term Mass comes from the Latin missa or messa, meaning to dismiss or to send away. Therefore, we see the connection between the word Mass and the belief that forgiveness of sins is received in the observance of the Lord's Supper. So, but that's all that we're going to deal with in regard to that terminology. Now we're going to go to this one. Have you ever seen or heard of the term Eucharist used in regard to the Lord's Supper? Eucharist. By the way, this is a biblical word. All right? It comes from EU, which is good, and charis, which can be grace or gift. But the rendering of the word, by the way, now here's one thing that I want to, and I said this a long time ago, and I've said it in the past, but I want to make sure that we understand here. Just because you have a compound word does not mean that the compound word necessarily means exactly what the two words that put it together mean. Does that make sense? In other words, you take good and you take give, and all of a sudden you think, well, this word means good gift. But that's not what it means at all. You know, it's just like butterfly. You know, butterfly is not a combination of butter and fly. Right? You know, there's not a combination of butter and flies that you put together to get butterfly. And in this sense, the word Eucharist appears 38 times in the New Testament. All right? And here's how it's rendered every time. Are you ready? Thanks. Thanks. Giving of thanks. Or thanksgiving. For example, prayer, supplications, intercessions, and giving of thanks to be made for all men. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 1. Giving of thanks. Eucharist. Eucharist. Now, this word is associated with the Lord's Supper. Alright? It is associated with the Lord's Supper. But not in any sense in which the supper is identified with the word. Look at Matthew 26 and verse 27. Look at Matthew 26 and verse 27. All right? Now, what's the context here in Matthew 26, 26 to 29? What is it? What? Institution of the Lord's Supper. All right? What does it say Jesus did in verse 27? What? He took the cup and gave thanks. Gave thanks. That's that word. In every instance where we have the institution of the Lord's Supper, the Bible says in every instance in the institution of the supper that Jesus gave thanks. Right? Does that have anything to do with the Lord's Supper itself, so far as the elements are concerned? None whatsoever. Look at Matthew 15 and verse 36. Look at Matthew 15 and verse 36. This is one of the incidents where Jesus took a little bit of food and turned it into food for a lot. Tell me what he did in Matthew 15, 36 with regard to the loaves and the fishes. Gave thanks. He gave thanks. Guess what? The gave thanks in Matthew 26 is exactly the same as gave thanks in Matthew 15, 36. So, in other words, what I'm getting across to you is that this word simply means to give thanks. And it's not in any way directly connected to the Lord's Supper other than the fact that Jesus gave thanks for those elements. In other words, he didn't identify the elements as Eucharist. He gave thanks for those elements. Does that make sense? And so it's not a matter of what he identified. And by the way, the supper is never called the Eucharist in the New Testament. And there's never any use of this word in a connective way to identifying the Lord's Supper, although it does talk about something that takes place in the Lord's Supper. Now, by the way, this is oftentimes rendered blessed. For example, in our King James Bible, he took bread and he what? Blessed it. Right. Now here's where we make some mistakes. Here's where we make some mistakes. When the Bible says that Jesus blessed the bread, he blessed it. That doesn't mean he magically conferred some power into it or miraculously conferred some power into it. You know, sometimes, and the problem is that we end up using terminology in such a way as to not use it in the same way that Jesus used it. Now, and I'm not trying to throw off or anybody, I'm just trying to make a corrective statement here. It is not correct for us to ask the Lord to bless the elements of the Lord's Supper. Number one, because you can't tell me what that means. You can't tell me what that means. If you ask the Lord to bless the elements of the Lord's Supper, what are you asking Him to do? Why do we say it? I'll tell you why we say it. Because most of us grew up and cut our teeth on the King James Version of the Bible, and we heard other people pray that in their prayer, and we have, by means of just hearing it over and over again, we've adopted that terminology. The question, what are we asking? If I ask the Lord to bless the elements of the Lord's Supper, what am I asking Him to do? Because Jesus didn't do anything to these elements. When the Bible says He blessed them, He didn't do anything to it. He gave thanks for them. That's what He did. And so we shouldn't ask the Lord to do something for us today that Jesus didn't ask for God to do when He instituted the supper. Now look, here's what's going to happen. All right, y'all ready for this? I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. I'm like Amos. All right? I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. But somebody is going to ask the Lord to bless these elements at some point. They're going to stand behind this table at some point, and just by way of habit is going to say that. And you know what? You're not going to go to hell for it. Okay? But everybody in this audience is going to say, oh, Todd said don't do that. And then it's going to mess the whole thing up. Because all you're going to think about is, he said bless, and Todd said that's not right. All right? Now, when that happens, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And everybody that's in this audience tonight is going to remember what I just said 5 minutes ago. You're going to say, Todd's right. You know what you need to do? Get your mind back on the supper. When it happens, put your mind back on the supper.
Well, I want to ask you a question. What if you were giving thanks for food that you're about to eat?
I think there is a connection. We ask the Lord to bless the food that we're about to eat. All right? Again, that comes from this. That comes from this, where Jesus took those fishes and loaves and blessed them. And we're taking this language and we're using it in a way that the Bible doesn't use it. Although you could say that in asking that you're simply just praying that the food is good for you and that the food will nourish us and help us to be strong, that we can carry out the Lord's work in a fine way.
Sometimes I think, well, the way He blessed me, give me this food, He's blessing me.
Yeah, but in that sense, it's still the giving of thanks. The Lord's blessed me, so I don't ask Him to bless the food that He's blessed me with. I give Him thanks for blessing me. that make sense? Again, somebody's going to ask for a blessing on the food, and you know what you're going to say? Todd said that. Todd said that. And guess what? You're still not going to be lost for saying it. But I'm just saying we want to try to understand where a lot of this terminology comes, and show that even we ourselves, for many, many years, have been guilty of using terminology in a way that the Bible does not use that terminology. So the idea of the Eucharist. It is a misuse of the term for the giving of thanks. All right. Any questions about this with regard to terminology? All right. Now I want to talk about one more thing, and that is, and I'm going to leave this up here. All right. Because some of you probably didn't bring your notebook, and you're going to want to take a picture of it with your phone. Bring it. Now we're going to talk about closed communion. I want to talk about the concept of closed communion. Now, the concept of closed communion is that only Christians can partake of the Lord's Supper. All right? And a lot of our religious friends and neighbors, and our Baptist friends in particular, practice what is called closed communion. They have a specific communion service, and if you're not a member of that church, you are not invited. You don't go, you don't participate. In that sense, they do their best to limit all the participants in the Lord's Supper to only those who are members of the Baptist church. That's why it's called closed communion. Now, look, they're not the only group that practices that. Other groups practice closed communion. All right? But for us in our area, that's the group that we would know the best that does practice it. Now, is it true that only Christians can partake of the Lord's Supper? Kyle says yes, Rhonda says no. And you know what? They're both right. They're both right. Depending on what your view is of how you're talking about taking the Lord's Supper. Kyle is right and Rhonda is right. You want me to tell you how they're both right? You want to know?
If you're not a Christian, it's not the Lord's Supper.
Because Kyle's perspective is, if you're not a Christian, it's not the Lord's Supper to you insofar as the Lord is concerned. Rhonda says a non-Christian can take the Lord's Supper because we see not that Rhonda would see it sitting here, but I'm sure she knows that, and anybody that's ever served has served somebody that we know is not a Christian and watched that person partake of the Lord's Supper.
You can't stop somebody.
That's right. You can't stop somebody.
I mean, they can take it.
All right. So, but to them, it's not the Lord's Supper.
Yeah. And
So that's why they're both right.
But I'm just saying.
Ma'am?
What do they think it is?
Well, they think it's the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
But so far as the Lord is concerned, the Lord does not recognize them as observing the Lord's Supper. It doesn't mean anything.
Right. But when you're passing the Lord's Supper down, you don't say, "Oh, wait, no."
Kathy, I see the wheels turning. Now I'm gonna try to, Ricky Ricard, I'm gonna explain it to you. All right. Let's say we got some folks sitting right here. All right, sitting right here, and they've got visitors with them that are not members of the Lord's church. And it's time for Sunday morning, and it's time for the elements to be passed out. And our members are sitting here, and their guests are sitting down, and they take the Lord's Supper, and they hand it down, and the non-Christian partakes of it. Okay? Now, in the way that we think, we say, well, they just took the Lord's Supper. Right? But did they?
No.
They didn't.
No. They just eat bread.
All they did was eat some bread and drink a little grape juice. Because the Lord's Supper can only be observed by those who are members of the church that are kingdom citizens. And so maybe no, they are not. They are not. And you're one step ahead of me. You've been hanging around Walter too long. All right, here it is. The passage. All right, did you hear what Catherine asked?
Yes.
Are they not eating and drinking damnation to their souls in the observance of the Lord's Supper? And the answer to that, you know I'm going to say the answer is no, right? You know I was going to say the answer is no. But now I'm going to show you why the answer is no.
Well, their souls
Where is the text that says he eats and drinks damnation to his soul? Where is it? 1 Corinthians 11. All right, starting in about verse 28. So let's open up our Bibles there. Let's open up our Bibles there. 1 Corinthians 11. I just pulled 28 out of my head. It may not be 28, but it'll be close. I missed it by one. I missed it by one. But we got to go back to verse 27 to get the context. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks damnation or judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. And for this reason, many of, next word please, many of, mine does, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. Now, who is this? I'm going to write it up here. 1 Corinthians 11, 27, say to 30. Who is instructed here? Christians. What is the context here? What's going on in this context that Paul's correcting the Lord's Supper? They've turned it into, number one, they've turned it into a common meal where some are partaking to the exclusion of others. And Paul said, this is not right. And so those who were in the church who had perverted the Lord's Supper were eating and drinking damnation to their souls because they weren't discerning the Lord's body. Neither were they discerning His body in the sense in which the supper was given. They also weren't discerning the body of the local church because there's the local body that is also under consideration. And so it is not to eat and drink damnation to one's soul when a non-Christian partakes of the supper, because so far as the Lord is concerned, it didn't mean a thing.
Plus, that person does not have the ability to, in an educated way, examine themselves, whether they're worthy or not. They don't know the truth, so they don't know if they're worthy.
And let me make one more statement here. King James says unworthily, right? Is that right, Walter?
Yeah.
Unworthily. What's the New King James say? What's the New King James say? Say unworthy manner. Alright, now. Alright, Miss English teacher.
Adverb.
What part of speech is that?
Adverb.
Adverb. Adverb. What do adverbs modify?
Actually, three different things.
What do adverbs modify?
Verbs.
Verbs.
Adjectives and other adverbs.
Now, question. The writer says actually three things. Verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. What is missing from that list? Nouns. So the word unworthily modifies what? What? The action. And not the person. And yet, many times, how many Christians have misunderstood that passage and said, I'm not worthy to partake because, and I'm not going to partake because I don't want to partake unworthily.
Unworthy is an adjective that describes the noun manner, though.
But the manner is still the action.
Okay, I'm just saying. Unworthy is an adjective.
Yeah, unworthy is not an adverb.
No.
Unworthy is an adjective that describes a noun, and the noun is the what? The manner in which it is observed, not the person. And that's where, look, I've known, listen, through the years, and literally all my life, I have known people, brethren, that I love, and even some that have been my kinfolk, that have not partaken of the Lord's Supper for years. For years. Even though they may attend every single assembly, Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, but they have misunderstood this passage and have failed to observe the Lord's Supper. Now they did it with sincerity of heart. They did it because they didn't want to offend the Lord. They did it because they didn't want to be in violation of the Bible, and yet they're wrong.
Well, none of us are worthy.
Nobody's worthy,
We stand every day.
but the blood of Christ makes us worthy. The blood of Christ makes us worthy.
I think it's people that are willfully sinning. That consider themselves unworthy.
And you know what? And I think if a person was doing that, if they were in a willful sin, they ought not to partake. You know, because you know what they need to do? Repent. And then start partaking.
I know. But I'm just saying, I know some of the people that you're talking about.
Sure.
And I think they're in a willful sin.
And I understand that, but some of them that I know just missed the point. So the unworthiness is in what they were doing and not in the... Look, man, the Corinthian church was a train wreck. Right? I mean, those people were a train wreck. I mean, they had a guy that had his father's wife. They had people that didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They had people going to law against one another. I mean, they had just about every problem you can think of. That church was a train wreck. And yet, every one of them was still to observe the Lord's Supper. Every one of them. But Paul said, the way that you're doing it damns your soul. Not necessarily the life that you're living outside the assembly. The way you're observing this, you've caused judgment to be brought on yourself. And so Christians are being instructed in this thing. Not non-Christians. Here's another example. You know, when we dismiss from here, and everybody gets to turn the lights out and the kids are in there painting, is there anything wrong with me drinking that?
No.
Not a thing in the world wrong with me drinking that, right?
Grape juice.
It's just grape juice, right? That's all it is. When it's used in the Lord's Supper to the Christian, it becomes a representation of the blood of Christ. Even though 24 hours earlier, it's sitting on a shelf at Walmart. Right?
Well, or wherever you got it.
Or wherever you got it, right, Walter?
I wouldn't know.
Well, most of ours comes from Walmart, I can assure you that. So, wait a minute. So, this is grape juice. when it is incorporated into the observance of the Lord's Supper, it becomes a remembrance or emblem to remind us of the blood of Jesus. But again, outside of that use, it's still just grape juice.
Well, at the time that the Lord's Supper was instructed at first, that would have been two of the most common things for people of that
That's
time.
exactly right. That was
They would have probably been used every day.
every single day. Well, look, it was at the Feast of the Passover. And the Feast of the Passover inaugurated the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And for 7 days, Jews could only eat unleavened bread for 7 days. That's that right there is all they got to eat for 7 days. All right, and so as Kyle said, these were very common things. And by the way, they were at hand when the supper was instituted. That shows us the commonality of the elements. But when they're incorporated into the supper, they are something different because of what they represent in the supper. But outside the supper, they are what they are. They are what they are. Yeah, Walter.
It says fruit of the vine. Does that only mean grape juice?
Now, Walter, that's on my list.
Well, I didn't know it.
It's on my list.
Well, I got another. How many times have you ever seen white grape juice used in Lord's Supper?
Well, it was done here one time because I bought some. And everybody gave it a strange look because it didn't look right.
I'm just curious.
So, yeah, I've done it. But it was because I got in a bind and had to go buy some at the last minute. And all I had was by the way, when Bill Burke and I told you when Bill Burke and I observed the supper in Rome, because there was no church for us to go to, and we couldn't find grape juice. It was all alcohol. We bought the grapes that we bought were white grapes, and we just crushed them up in a glass, because those are the only grapes we could, that we were able to find. But
when we went to church in Rome, it was wine.
But we found, when Ron and I went to Rome, we found a church and it was wine. It was wine. All right. Now, I'm holding off on that until 2 weeks from tonight. I'm holding off on the alcohol and the fruit of the vine aspect until 2 weeks from tonight, because we got two or three more things associated with Lord's Supper that I want us to deal with, and so I'm going to hold off. I'm going to hold off on that until then. Any other questions on what we got here? Any? No.
This seemed like the cover, you talk about cover, it represents his blood, it looks like, it should be.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's a fake.
But it doesn't say red fruit of the vine.
Yeah, because
Or
grape
purple
juice is
either.
purple.
Or purple.
Purple and red.
Yeah. All right.
It's blood, not